I lost my locksmith business 18 months ago, drowning in debt I'd taken on trying to keep it alive, and I was 2 months from losing my apartment too when I found a job posting that made no sense and paid enough that I stopped caring whether it made sense. Night shift locksmith needed. Isolated location. Room and board provided. Pay far beyond anything the work should have justified. I called the number, and a man with a slow, careful voice told me the town was called Ashwick Hollow, gave me driving directions that didn't match any road system I could find on a map, and told me someone would meet me at the edge of town because the GPS wouldn't get me the rest of the way in. He was right about that. My phone lost signal almost 9 miles out, and the paved road just stopped being paved at some point I never consciously noticed, turning to hard-packed dirt that wound up through increasingly dense mountain forest with no signage anywhere, no mile markers, no town limit sign, nothing to tell me I'd arrived anywhere at all until the trees opened up and I was simply, suddenly, driving down the main street of a town that shouldn't have been able to exist that far from any road I'd actually followed to get there. Ashwick Hollow doesn't appear on any current map I've ever found, digital or paper. It doesn't have a listed zip code. When I asked later how mail gets delivered, the man who met me, an older resident named Corwin Boyce, who I'd eventually learned served as something like an unofficial town elder, told me simply that people mostly didn't need mail out here and left it at that. I want to be honest about my state of mind arriving that first night. I was too relieved at the size of the paycheck to interrogate any of this the way I should have. Desperate people talk themselves out of asking hard questions. I was a desperate person. Corwin walked me to the workshop that would be both my job and my living quarters. A squat stone building at the edge of town, well over a century old by the look of the foundation, with a small apartment built into the back half and the locksmith's shop taking up the front. He handed me a set of keys to the building itself and told me plainly that the previous locksmith had left rather suddenly about 6 months prior, and that the town badly needed someone to fill the role, and that I shouldn't worry too much about the particulars of the job until I'd had a chance to settle in. I asked what happened to the previous locksmith. Corwin's face did something complicated before he answered. Not quite sorrow, not quite fear, something more resigned than either. He opened the wrong one, he said. When I asked him to clarify what that meant, he just told me I'd understand soon enough, wished me a good first night, and left. The workshop itself is the first thing that told me this job was not what the posting implied. Every wall is covered floor to ceiling with keys, thousands of them hanging on pegboards and hooks and old iron racks that must predate the building's electrical wiring by decades. Most look ordinary enough at a glance, brass and iron and steel, the kind of key you'd expect in any hardware store. But scattered among them, unmarked and unremarked upon, are keys that aren't ordinary at all. Keys cut from something that looks like black glass, cold to the touch even in a warm room. Keys that feel faintly warm no matter the temperature outside, like something living sits just beneath the metal. Keys with no teeth at all, smooth shafts that shouldn't be able to turn any lock and yet clearly from the wear patterns on them, had been used for exactly that purpose many times. And, strangest of all to me that first night, a small cluster of keys that seemed to shift their shapes slightly whenever I looked away and back, never dramatically, just enough that I couldn't be entirely sure I was remembering their outline correctly from one glance to the next. Bolted to the floor in the center of the workshop, chained with iron links thick enough to anchor a ship, sits one enormous key, the size of my forearm, dark iron gone black with age, resting on a stone plinth like something in a museum display rather than a working tool. I asked Corwin about it during that first walkthrough. He told me only that it belonged to a door I would hopefully never need to open, and that every locksmith who'd ever worked this shop had been given the exact same instruction about it. Never use this key no matter what anyone tells you, no matter what you believe the circumstances require. I didn't sleep much that first night. Not from fear yet, not really, more from the disorienting sense of having landed somewhere that operated on rules I didn't understand and hadn't been given time to learn. The workshop had a smell to it I couldn't place at first, something underneath the ordinary machine oil and metal filing smell any locksmith shop carries. Faint, cold, mineral, the way air smells right before snow even on a mild night. I noticed it strongest near the chain key in the center of the room, fainter everywhere else, and I remember standing there at almost 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, just breathing it in and trying to convince myself it was nothing, some quirk of old stone and older iron, nothing worth losing more sleep over. By the second night, I had my first customer, and I understood a great deal more than I wanted to. Nobody in Ashwick Hollow pays with anything I recognized as currency. Every single customer who came through that workshop in all the months I worked there paid in the same worn antique silver coins, not modern minted silver but old, heavy, hand-struck pieces with faces and dates I never once managed to look up successfully because every time I tried, the coin seemed to catch the light wrong in whatever photo I tried to take of it, blurring in a way that made the details impossible to capture. Corwin told me when I finally asked that the coins were simply how business was done out here, and that I'd find they were worth more than I might expect if I ever needed to spend one somewhere the money actually mattered. I never tested that claim. I kept every coin I earned in a locked drawer in my apartment, and something about them made me reluctant to spend even one. The customers themselves came only at night, always alone, always polite in a formal, careful way that felt rehearsed rather than natural, like people reciting the correct manners for a situation they'd been warned was dangerous to get wrong. Nobody explained what they needed unlocked beyond the bare minimum required to do the job. Nobody stayed past sunrise, no matter how complicated the work. My third night on the job, a priest came to the workshop just after midnight, dressed in plain black, carrying nothing but a small brass key that clearly didn't fit whatever he needed opened, because he set it on my counter and asked, in a voice kept carefully level, whether I could cut him a replacement for a coffin lock. Not a coffin he wanted to open, he clarified quickly when he saw my expression. A coffin he needed to make certain stayed shut. He said the original key had been lost 3 generations back in his family, passed down as a solemn duty even without the actual object, and that the coffin itself sat in a small mausoleum on the edge of town that nobody visited except to check, once a decade or so, that the newly cut lock was holding. He waited while I worked, standing very still near the door rather than sitting in the chair I offered him, his hands folded in front of him the entire time like a man at prayer, or a man forcing himself to look calmer than he felt. I asked him carefully what was in the coffin. He looked at me for a long moment, the same complicated expression Corwin had worn describing the previous locksmith, and said only, "Something that used to be a person, a very long time ago before it stopped being anything you'd want to meet." He didn't elaborate further, and I didn't ask a second time. I cut the key, watched him test it twice in a spare practice lock I kept for exactly that purpose. His hands trembling slightly both times, though his voice never wavered, and he left before I could ask anything else, leaving 1 silver coin on the counter and nothing more. He paused at the door before stepping out into the dark and said without turning around, "Thank you for not asking why my family took this on in the first place. Most of us have stopped asking that too." Then he was gone and I never saw him again. A few weeks later, a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, arrived alone close to 2 in the morning, carrying an old leather suitcase that knocked, softly and rhythmically, from somewhere inside it, as though something small was patiently rapping its knuckles against the lining. She set it on my counter without a word and pointed at the latch, which had rusted shut sometime in what looked like the far distant past. I remember being far more unsettled by her calm than I would have been by fear. She didn't flinch at the knocking. She stood there patiently, hands folded the same careful way the priest had been, watching me work with the mild, unbothered patience of a child waiting for a parent to finish a boring errand, as if a suitcase that knocked from the inside was simply one more ordinary fact of her small life, no stranger to her than a loose shoelace. I asked her gently what was inside. She just shook her head, the way children do when they've been told very clearly not to answer a particular question, and pointed at the latch again. I worked the rust loose as carefully as I could, and the moment the latch gave, the knocking from inside stopped completely, all at once, the way a sound stops when whoever's making it realizes they've been heard and doesn't want to be anymore. The girl's shoulders relaxed, just slightly, the first real change of expression I'd seen from her all night, and she thanked me in a small, careful voice, took the suitcase without opening it to check my work, and left 1 coin behind exactly where the priest had left his. I watched her walk back out into the dark street alone, no adult waiting for her anywhere I could see, and something about that, a child that age, alone at 2 in the morning, entirely unbothered by any of it, stayed with me longer than almost anything else that happened that first month. I asked Corwin about her the next day, the way I'd started doing after every strange visit, hoping each time for some piece of context that would make the last one make sense. He told me only that some families in Ashwick Hollow carry a burden instead of an heirloom, generation to generation, and that the suitcase's latch needed replacing roughly once every childhood, always by whichever child in that family line was currently old enough to be trusted with the responsibility, and that asking what was inside it was considered, among the older residents, close to the rudest question a person could pose. The third visitor I want to tell you about came alone on a moonless night, a middle-aged man in a heavy coat despite the mild weather, who stood in the doorway of my workshop for almost a full minute before stepping inside, and who positioned himself, once he finally did enter, at an unusual angle relative to my overhead light, angled specifically, I realized after a moment, so that his shadow fell backward through the open door behind him rather than forward onto my workshop floor. He needed a lock replaced on what he described only as a private room in his home, and he was careful, throughout our entire conversation, never to let his shadow cross the threshold or touch any interior surface of my shop, stepping awkwardly around the light fixtures, angling his body strangely whenever I moved my lamp to get a better look at the lock mechanism he'd brought in. When I finally asked him, as delicately as I could manage, why he was so careful about it, he answered with what I've come to understand is the standard Ashwick Hollow response to any question that gets too close to the truth. A long pause, a complicated expression, and finally, because it isn't always mine anymore after dark. Better everyone stays where they belong. I didn't ask a follow-up question. By that point, 3 customers in, I'd started to understand that the town operated on a shared, unspoken agreement that some things were simply managed rather than explained, generation after generation, and that my job wasn't to understand the full shape of what I was maintaining. My job was just to maintain it. I want to tell you about one more visitor from those early weeks, though, because it's the only one that felt gentle rather than heavy, and I've held on to it since. An old woman named Fern Whitcomb came by one quiet night, not for any lock at all, but just to bring me a warm loaf of bread and sit with me for a while at the workshop counter. She told me she'd done the same for every locksmith the town had ever had, going back to when she was a young woman herself, because she remembered how frightening those first weeks could be before you found your footing, and she thought it mattered that someone came by just to talk about ordinary things. Her garden, the weather, a grandson who was learning to play fiddle badly but enthusiastically. She never once asked me about the keys on the wall or what I'd already seen. She just let me be a person for an hour, tired and overwhelmed, without needing to also be the town's locksmith for that stretch of time. She left before I even noticed the hour had passed, and I found half the loaf still warm on my counter the next morning, wrapped carefully in cloth, like she'd known I wouldn't remember to eat before falling asleep. I think about Fern more than almost anyone else from my time there. Whatever this town is protecting itself from, whatever weight it's carried for generations, it hasn't managed to crush every ordinary kindness out of the people living inside it. That's mattered to me more than I expected it to. Most of the work happened in the workshop, but not all of it. About 2 months in, Corwin came to me one evening with a request that fell outside anything I'd handled so far. A lockout in the countryside that needed servicing on-site, too large or too fixed in place to bring to me the way the coffin key or the suitcase latch had come. He drove me out himself, well past the edge of what I understood as the town proper, along a dirt track that wound through increasingly open country until we reached a wheat field, vast and empty under a clear night sky, with absolutely nothing else visible for what looked like miles in any direction. Standing alone in the middle of that field, with no walls, no structure, no fence line leading to it or away from it, was a single wooden door, upright in its frame, weathered gray with age, fitted with an old iron lock that had apparently begun sticking badly enough that the town's usual rotation of caretakers could no longer turn it reliably. The drive out there took almost 40 minutes, most of it in silence, and I remember watching the tree line thin out into open country and thinking how strange it was that a town this isolated, this deliberately hidden from every road system I understood, would have farmland at all, let alone farmland that seemed to serve no visible agricultural purpose. When I asked Corwin about it, he just said the wheat grew on its own, had for as long as anyone could remember, and that nobody in town had ever needed to plant or harvest it deliberately. It simply kept growing, thick and undisturbed, around a door that had apparently always stood there. I asked Corwin, standing there in that impossible wheat field, what the door actually led to. He told me in the same careful tone I'd come to recognize as the town's default register for uncomfortable truths, that nobody currently living had ever opened it far enough to see, and that the job wasn't to find out. The job was simply to keep the lock in good working order so that whoever was assigned to check on it, once every season, could turn the key smoothly enough to confirm it was still sealed, without ever actually pulling the door open. I worked on that lock for almost 2 hours, kneeling in wheat that swayed with no wind I could feel, and about 40 minutes in, the mechanism did something no ordinary lock should do. The keyhole itself seemed to shift position slightly while I had my tools inserted, sliding maybe half an inch to one side, forcing me to physically reposition my pick to keep working. I mentioned this to Corwin, who was standing a respectful distance back the entire time, arms crossed, watching the tree line rather than the door itself. He told me without much surprise in his voice that the lock did that sometimes, and that the trick was simply to follow it patiently rather than force it, the same way you'd handle any stubborn old mechanism that had earned the right to be difficult. About an hour into the work, kneeling close enough to the door that my ear was nearly against the wood, I heard something from the other side that I've never fully been able to describe since. Not a voice exactly, and not quite the low groaning sound I'd hear later at the church, but something rhythmic and patient, almost like breathing, if breathing could be stretched out slow enough to last minutes instead of seconds. I froze completely for a moment, tools still in the lock, and Corwin, without looking directly at me, said quietly, "It knows you're there. It's always known. Just keep working." It's patient in a way that should scare you less than it does, not more. Patient things don't usually rush. I don't know if that was meant to comfort me. It didn't, particularly, but it was enough to get my hands moving again. When I finally got the lock turning smoothly again, tested twice without ever fully releasing the latch, Corwin let out a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding, and we drove back to town in near total silence. The second house call came almost a month later, and it's the one I still think about most, because it's the one that finally cracked open my understanding of what this job actually protected. Corwin took me to the town's only church, a modest wooden building near the center of Ashwick Hollow that I'd walked past dozens of times without paying much attention. He led me not through the front doors, but around to a side entrance I'd never noticed, down a narrow set of exterior stairs to a heavy iron door set into the building's foundation. I asked him, confused, why a wooden church this size would have a full stone basement beneath it at all, let alone one requiring a locksmith's specialized attention. He told me quietly that the church didn't have a basement, structurally speaking. The architectural plans on record in town showed no such space, and yet the door and the stairs leading to it had existed for as long as anyone could remember, occupying a space that, by every measurement that should have mattered, simply wasn't there. Standing at the top of those exterior stairs, I noticed the temperature had dropped noticeably the closer we got to the door, a cold that had nothing to do with the mild night air above us, sharp and mineral in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of that same faint smell I'd noticed in my workshop my first night, near the chained key. Corwin noticed me shiver and simply nodded like this was expected, like every locksmith before me had probably shivered at that exact same step. The lock on that basement door was unlike anything else I'd worked on in my life before or since. It took 3 different keys in sequence to even begin the process, each one triggering some separate internal mechanism I could hear shifting inside the door itself, deep clicks and grinds that didn't match the door's modest size. And when I finally got the last mechanism to engage, the door let out a low, drawn-out groan that didn't sound structural at all. It sounded unmistakably pained, like something enduring a procedure it had no way to consent to or refuse. I froze at that sound. Corwin, standing beside me, put a steadying hand on my shoulder and told me, gently but firmly, to keep working, that the door always made that sound during servicing and that stopping partway through was far more dangerous than finishing quickly. I finished the job as fast as my hands would let me, resealing every mechanism in reverse order, and the groaning stopped the instant the final lock clicked home, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the whole basement had been holding its breath along with me. For just a moment, right before that final silence settled in, I thought I heard something else beneath the groan, faint, layered underneath it, almost like several voices instead of one, none of them forming words I could make out, all of them stopping at exactly the same instant the lock clicked home. I never mentioned that detail to Corwin. I'm not entirely sure I wanted it confirmed. There was a third house call about 6 weeks after the church that I want to tell you about too, because it's the one where I came closest to understanding just how many of these doors existed scattered through the country surrounding Ashwick Hollow. Far more, I suspect, than I've ever been told about directly. Corwin drove me nearly an hour into deep forest that night, well past the wheat field, past any trail I could have retraced on my own, to a small clearing where a steel vault door stood embedded directly into a rock outcropping. No visible building around it at all, no hinges or frame extending beyond the raw stone itself, as though the door had simply been grown into the mountain rather than installed. It looked, at a glance, more like something you'd find in a bank basement than in the middle of untouched wilderness. A heavy circular mechanism, a large steel wheel at its center, dulled with rust in places but clearly, deliberately, still maintained. I asked Corwin how something like that had gotten out here, this deep into forest with no road access I could see. He told me, in the same tired, patient voice he used for every question that skirted too close to an answer nobody had, that the vault predated the road system entirely, predated most of the town's written records, and that nobody currently living knew who had actually built it or how they'd managed to set steel that deep into solid rock without modern equipment. The lock mechanism itself was the most complex thing I'd worked on yet, not a keyhole in the traditional sense, but a series of concentric dials requiring a specific sequence, each one engraved with symbols I didn't recognize from any alphabet I'd ever studied. Corwin handed me a small brass rod instead of a key, told me it would resonate faintly when each dial reached its correct position, and that I'd need to feel for that resonance in my hand rather than see or hear it, since the vibration was apparently too subtle to detect any other way. It took nearly 3 hours. Twice, I felt the rod grow warm in my palm at what I thought was the correct position, only for the resonance to fade the instant I tried to lock it in, forcing me to start that particular dial sequence over from the beginning. The third time it happened, on the same dial, I made the mistake of forcing it slightly rather than starting over, applying just a bit more pressure than the resonance seemed to want, and the entire vault door let out a single deep metallic groan, low enough that I felt it in my chest before I heard it, and the brass rod went ice cold in my hand for several seconds afterward. Corwin didn't need to say anything. I started that dial over from the beginning without being told, and didn't try to rush any of the remaining sequence again, no matter how long it took. Corwin stood well back from the vault door the entire time, further back than he'd stood at either the wheat field or the church, and I noticed about 2 hours in, that he'd stopped watching the door entirely and had turned to face the tree line instead, the same posture he'd held at the wheat field, like he found it easier to trust his ears than his eyes out here. Near the end, with only the final dial left to set, I heard something from behind that steel door that was different from anything at the other 2 locations. Not breathing, not groaning, but something closer to scratching, faint and rhythmic, metal on stone, coming from a distance I couldn't judge at all, close or impossibly far. It was impossible to tell through steel that thick. I asked Corwin if that was normal. He was quiet for a moment before answering, which by that point in my time there I'd learned to recognize as its own kind of answer. "That one's different from the others," he finally said. "Older maybe. Or just more patient about letting us know it's aware of us. Either way, it's never done more than scratch, far as anyone's ever recorded. Finish the dial. Let's not give it more of our attention than it's already getting for free." I finished the sequence. The final dial clicked home with a sound like a held breath finally releasing, and the scratching stopped instantly, the same abrupt, total silence I'd heard at the church basement, like whatever was back there understood exactly the moment the lock engaged and had no interest in continuing once it had. We didn't speak much on the drive back, both of us worn thin in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Corwin did tell me one thing though, as we finally came back within sight of the town's outer buildings, something that stayed with me since. "There are more of these scattered out past the tree line than I've ever walked you to," he said. "More than I've walked to myself, if I'm honest. The town keeps a rotation, and no one locksmith services all of them in a single lifetime. You're not meant to know how many there are. Just that there's always at least one more than you've seen." I asked him quietly whether that thought ever kept him up at night, the not knowing of it, the sense of a number that could be small or could be enormous and no way to ever confirm which. He was quiet for the rest of the drive, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer at all, until we pulled up outside my workshop and he finally said, "Every night since I was young enough to first understand what this town actually is." Then he wished me a good rest of my evening, the same way he always did, and drove off into the dark. Corwin didn't say much else on the walk back to the workshop that night. Just before he left me at my door, though, he told me something I've carried with me since. "Every lock in this town serves the same purpose, even the ones that don't look alike," he said. "You're not opening anything for anyone, not really, no matter what it looks like on the surface. You're the reason it all stays exactly where it's supposed to stay." Sullivan understood that too for a long while, right up until he decided he didn't. That name, Sullivan, sent me back into the workshop's back rooms that same night, searching through drawers and shelves I hadn't fully explored yet, looking for anything the previous locksmith might have left behind. I found it eventually tucked behind a false panel at the back of a supply cabinet. A worn leather notebook, water-stained, filled with cramped handwriting that grew progressively less steady across its pages, as though whoever wrote it had been sleeping less and less as time went on. I sat on the floor of that back room and read it cover to cover in one sitting, unable to make myself stop even as it grew harder to read. Most of the early entries were practical, notes on specific locks, which coins certain families favored, small observations about which customers preferred which hours, a rough map of house call locations sketched in the margins with distances noted in his own paces rather than any standard measurement. He seemed, in those early pages, almost content, the way I imagine I sounded to myself during my own first weeks, cautiously settling into a strange but manageable rhythm. But as the notebook progressed, the entries shifted tone, becoming shorter, more urgent, more like warnings left for whoever came next than a working log. Somewhere around the middle third, the handwriting itself changed. Smaller, tighter, pressed harder into the page as if he'd started writing late at night with the door braced shut behind him. "Never make 2 copies of any key in this shop. 1 is a tool. 2 is a temptation, and eventually someone will use the second one. Never ask what's behind a door you're servicing. The town will tell you if you truly need to know. If they haven't told you, you don't need to know, and asking only makes the lock harder to trust you. If a lock ever opens itself with no key involved, run. Don't investigate. Don't call out to see if anyone's there. Just run, and don't look back toward the door until you're certain you've put real distance between yourself and it. The chain key isn't heavy because of the iron. Held it once just to feel the weight everyone talks about. It isn't the metal that's heavy. I think I understand now why they never leave. I don't think it's a rule. I think it's something closer to gravity." The final entry on the last written page was shorter than all the others, just 1 line, written in handwriting so hurried it was barely legible, the pen pressed hard enough in places to tear slightly through the paper. "They're not keeping people out." Nothing followed it. The rest of the notebook was blank, dozens of empty pages after that single sentence, as though he'd meant to keep writing and simply never did again. I sat with that single sentence for a long time that night, turning it over, trying to understand what Sullivan had realized right before he vanished, and rereading that earlier line about gravity, wondering if the 2 thoughts were connected, wondering what exactly a person understands right before they stop being able to write it down. It wasn't until I finally worked up the nerve to ask Corwin directly, point blank, what the town was actually protecting itself from, that I understood the full weight of what Sullivan had written. Corwin gathered a handful of the town's oldest residents at the workshop the following evening, an unusual event, I gathered from how carefully everyone arranged themselves, and probably one that hadn't happened for whoever trained Sullivan either, until it became necessary the same way it apparently now was for me. I counted 6 of them total, seated in a loose half-circle around my counter, Fern Whitcomb among them, her expression far more solemn than it had been the night she'd brought me bread. An elderly woman named Agatha Pruitt did most of the talking. She told me that a very long time ago, longer than any written record the town still kept, something beneath Ashwick Hollow had fractured. She used that specific word, fractured, like reality itself was a pane of glass that had taken a hard, unrepairable crack somewhere beneath the mountain. In the wake of that fracture, doors began appearing throughout the surrounding land. In places doors had no structural reason to exist, each one leading somewhere that should never have been allowed to connect to this world at all. "We didn't build these doors," Agatha said. "We didn't choose any of this. What we chose, generations back, was to keep every single one of them locked, rather than let whatever's on the other side decide for us how this ends. One of the men in the circle, introduced to me only as Otis, added that the town's founders hadn't understood at first what they were dealing with, that the earliest years, according to the oldest surviving records, had been marked by tragedy after tragedy before anyone realized doors needed tending rather than simply avoiding. They tried burning a few early on, he said. Tried filling others with stone. Neither worked the way you'd expect. Turns out you can't seal a wound like this shut by force. You can only manage it carefully, the way you'd manage any wound that's never quite going to heal all the way. She explained that the role of locksmith in Ashwick Hollow wasn't really about locksmithing in any conventional sense. It was about maintenance. Someone had to keep every lock functioning, every mechanism sound, every key precisely fitted to its door, because a lock that fails isn't just an inconvenience out here. A lock that fails is an opening. Only one person can hold all of it at once, she said. We don't fully understand why it has to be one person, only that it does, and that it's always been that way as far back as anyone's kept record. If you leave, Cormac, someone else has to be found quickly, and quickly isn't always fast enough. I asked carefully what happened in the gaps, the stretches of time between one locksmith leaving and the next one arriving. The room went quiet for a moment before Agatha answered, her voice lower than before. Those are the years we don't talk about much, she said. The town remembers them even if we don't discuss them at length. Let's just say every family here has lost someone during one gap or another, and leave it there for tonight. I asked her finally about the sentence in Sullivan's notebook. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered. They're not keeping people out, she repeated softly, like she'd hoped never to have to say it out loud herself. That's what he understood right before the end. Every lock in this town was built to keep something in, not to keep the rest of us out of somewhere we shouldn't go. We tell new locksmiths it's about protection, and it is, but it's easier for people to understand a door that keeps danger out than a door that's the only thing currently standing between danger and everyone else. Sullivan understood the difference. I think it broke something in him, understanding it that clearly. I asked what happened to him after that. Nobody answered directly. Corwin just told me gently that some people can carry the weight of that knowledge indefinitely, and some people can't, and that the town had no way of knowing in advance which kind of person they were asking to take the job. I want to tell you about the enormous chain key, the one bolted to the plinth in the center of my workshop, because I haven't fully explained what it's for, and because it's the reason I'm telling you any of this at all. Corwin explained it to me plainly once early on, in the same tone he used for everything else, matter of fact, worn smooth by generations of repetition. That key belongs to one door, the oldest and largest in the entire network the town maintains, and no locksmith in Ashwick Hollow's recorded history has ever used it. Not once. It isn't there to be used. It's there because removing it entirely was apparently more dangerous than simply keeping it chained where every new locksmith could see it, could understand its weight, could be reminded daily of the one rule that mattered more than any other. Never use this key, no matter what anyone tells you. No matter what you believe the circumstances require. I lived with that key in my workshop for 6 months without incident. I dusted around it. I stepped past it 1,000 times doing ordinary work. It became, in its own way, just another fixture of a job I'd slowly, uneasily, made my peace with. Some nights I'd catch myself talking to it, quietly, the way you talk to any object you spend enough hours alone with, not expecting an answer, just needing to fill the silence of an empty workshop at 3 in the morning. I never told anyone I did that. I'm not sure Corwin would have been surprised. 3 nights ago, I came downstairs from my apartment to open the shop for the evening and found the plinth empty. The chain lay coiled on the stone floor, links intact, unbroken, unpicked. Simply empty, as though the key had never needed to break anything to leave, only needed someone willing to lift it free. I stood in that doorway for a long time before I could make myself walk further into the room. The workshop felt different with the key gone, lighter in a way that should have been a relief and instead felt like the floor had quietly dropped an inch beneath me. Every other key on every wall seemed for just a moment to be watching that empty plinth the same way I was. I didn't call Corwin first. I should have. Instead, I did something closer to instinct than judgment. and followed a set of fresh footprints pressed into the light dust coating my workshop floor, out the door, down the main street, past every dark and shuttered building in town, toward the oldest structure in Ashwick Hollow. A squat stone building at the edge of the treeline that I'd always assumed was some kind of storage shed, and had never once been told otherwise. The walk took longer than it should have, or felt that way, the whole town silent around me in the particular way only a place with no cars and no street lights can be silent, just my own footsteps and, ahead of them, a second set I hadn't made, pressed into frost that had settled unevenly across the ground despite the mild night. I passed Fern's darkened window, the church with its hidden stairs, the edge of the wheat field visible in the far distance beyond the last row of houses, and every building I passed felt, for the first time since I'd arrived, like it was holding its breath the same way that basement had. The door was ajar. Not thrown open, not broken. Just open a few inches, the way a door sits when someone has stepped through it carefully and not bothered or not been able to pull it shut behind them. I stood there a long time before I made myself get close enough to see anything through that gap. When I finally did, I saw a narrow strip of space beyond the door that didn't match the modest stone building containing it. Not a shed's interior, not a room of any ordinary size at all, but something that looked, in the sliver I could make out, like distance. Real distance, stretching farther back than the building's outer walls could possibly contain, lit by no light source I could identify, the air beyond it faintly, impossibly cold against my face even from several feet away. And sitting just inside that gap, close enough to the opening that the last of the moonlight caught it clearly, was the enormous iron key, resting on the ground exactly the way you'd set something down deliberately, not dropped, not lost. Placed. Nobody had taken it to use it on anything. Someone had taken it to return it from the other side. I backed away from that door the same way I'd backed away from everything else this job had shown me, carefully, without turning my back on it fully until I'd put real distance between us, the way Sullivan's notebook told me to. I haven't gone back since. I haven't told Corwin what I saw, not yet, though I know I'll have to before the night is out, because a door that opens on its own, even a few inches, even briefly, is not something Ashwick Hollow can afford to leave unattended. I still don't know who returned that key or why, or what it means that something on the other side apparently knows exactly how the lock works well enough to set it back down rather than simply walk through carrying it. I keep thinking about Sullivan's handwriting, shakier with every page, and that one line he left behind before whatever happened to him happened. They're not keeping people out. I understand that sentence completely now. I don't think I understand yet what it means that the door found a way to answer back.